The joke was small. That was what made it dangerous. It floated across the grand chamber of Avera so lightly that for a second it almost sounded harmless. A few delegates smiled, then a few more, then the laughter spread in soft waves under the silver lights of the Galactic Council, warm and easy, as if nothing cruel had just been said at all. Jake Ellison sat in the back row, exactly where he had sat for the last 3 years. Not once had anyone asked if the human representative wanted a better seat. Not once had anyone seemed to notice that the man in the back was always there, always listening, always doing the patient work nobody else wanted to do. He had learned not to expect much. Still, that laugh landed harder than he wanted to admit. At the center podium, Delegate Vorat of the Thyan adjusted his robes and continued speaking as if he had not done anything important. He had been talking about failing supply routes in the outer systems. Then, with one lazy flick of his hand, he joked that perhaps the Council should ask the humans to clean up the problem, since they were already so good at being the galaxy's janitors. The room laughed. Jake did not. He looked around the chamber, at the polished desks, the flags of 100 species, the careful faces pretending not to notice him now. His chest did not burn, his hands did not shake. What he felt was worse than anger. He felt something go still. It was the stillness of a door closing deep inside a person, the kind that makes no sound at all. Without a word, Jake stood up and walked out. No one called after him. 6,000 light-years away, Commander Nate Caldwell stood on the bridge of the USS Starfall, watching the dark edge of the fringe corridor turn slowly across the main screen. The corridor was a lawless stretch of space filled with pirate nests, raider clans, and dead signal zones. Merchant convoys crossed it every week because they had no other choice. And every week, human ships kept them alive. Not one of the species using that corridor had ever volunteered patrol support. Not one had offered fuel, ships, or crews. They sent cargo. Humans sent people. At 0300 ship time, Nate received the message. It came through a channel so secure that even the bridge system struggled to open it. When it finally decoded, the order was short, clear, and impossible to misunderstand. Operation Silent Tide. All human military assets were to begin full withdrawal from the fringe corridor. No announcement, no protest, no farewell. Just leave. Nate read the message twice, then once more. Around him, the bridge remained quiet. Officers moved under dim blue light, waiting. He could hear the low hum of engines beneath his boots. He had spent 9 years out here protecting ships full of strangers who would never know his name. Now he was being told to stop. He called his executive officer to the bridge. "We begin the withdrawal tonight," he said. The officer stared at him. Without warning them? Nate looked back at the stars. "Yes," he said softly, "without warning." On the Dravari homeworld, Dr. Megan Holt was bent over a gene sequencer when her recall notice arrived. She had spent 11 years there fighting a respiratory plague that kept trying to rise again. The Dravari used her medicine, trusted her results, relied on her every week, but they never respected her. They spoke over her, laughed at her accent, called humans simple when they thought she could not hear. She heard. She always heard. The message from Earth came through on a secure line. Archive your work, transfer nothing, depart within 72 hours. Megan gripped the edge of her desk. She said, "If I leave now, the treatment stops." Silence answered first. Then a tired voice from Earth said, "They had 11 years to learn from you, Megan. They chose not to." She closed her eyes, because that was true. Across the galaxy, it began at all once. Human doctors sealed clinics. Human engineers powered down systems they had built. Human researchers locked their labs. Human workers packed their bags. They did not argue. They did not threaten. They simply left.
And the worst part was this. For a while, nobody noticed. That silence would cost the galaxy more than anyone yet understood. By the time the Council realized humanity was truly gone, the first disaster was already on its way.
The first disaster did not arrive with a warning. It arrived the way many terrible things do, in the middle of an ordinary day on a route that had always felt safe. The Corvi merchant convoy was 12 ships long, heavy with grain, medicine, machine parts, and families heading toward a colony beyond the Driak asteroid belt. They had made the same journey many times before. The captains knew the path. The traders knew the stops. The children on board played in the halls and looked out the windows at the stars, never once thinking they were in danger. Why would they? For years, the fringe corridor had been protected. Raiders stayed away. Pirate ships vanished before they got close enough to strike. Distress calls, when they happened, were answered fast. The convoy crews had come to think of safety as a natural part of the route. They never knew safety had a human face. No one told them that patrol ships had once moved quietly through the shadows beyond their sensors. No one told them that human crews had spent sleepless nights scanning dust clouds, tracking heat trails, and chasing threats away before those threats became visible. Protection had become invisible, and because it was invisible, everyone assumed it would always be there. It wasn't. The raiders came out of the asteroid dust just past the belt. 6 ships, black and fast, engines burning hard. They hit the convoy from both sides. The merchants had weak shields, almost no weapons, and no escort. The lead ship sent a distress signal across every emergency band. No one answered. The signal bounced through open space for 4 long hours, then died with the ship that sent it. By the end, all 12 convoy vessels were gone. 930 lives vanished into the dark. On Avira, Ambassador Rillis received the report in silence. She stood by her desk and read every line twice, as if a second reading might somehow change the numbers. It didn't. She knew exactly what had happened. Not every detail, not every scream or final message, but the truth beneath it. Those ships had not entered a suddenly dangerous corridor. They had entered a corridor that had always been dangerous. The only thing that had changed was that the people holding the line were gone. Rillis tried again to reach Earth through old diplomatic channels, then through private channels, then through a frequency Jake Ellison had once used for informal contact during a trade dispute. Each call gave her the same answer. Nothing. No static, no interference, just clean, deliberate silence. Across the Council, the first signs of strain began to appear. Fuel depots along old human routes started running low. Relay stations missed maintenance windows. Freight schedules slipped. Insurance rates spiked. Trade officers called it disruption. Logistics clerks called it delay. But Cephas, the Council's chief coordinator, looked at the numbers and felt fear settle in his bones. He ordered a deeper audit. What he found over the next 10 days made his hands shake. Humans had not just guarded trade lanes, they had supported them, paid for them, repaired them, and quietly held together nearly 40% of the Council's living infrastructure. Supply routes, beacon networks, refueling hubs, emergency response chains. Whole systems were standing on work no one had ever bothered to notice. Cephas carried the findings straight to Chancellor Vorath. Vorath glanced over the report with open irritation. "Then find replacements," he said. "There are none," Cephas replied. Vorath leaned back in his chair. The Council will adapt. But outside those walls, the galaxy was already learning a cruel lesson. Some things do not fall apart the moment they are abandoned. They keep working just long enough for everyone to believe nothing is wrong. Then they fail all at once. Rehook.
And while the Council was still pretending it had time, a dying world was about to learn what happened when one human scientist stopped coming to work.
On the Dravari homeworld, the first new cases appeared in the capital. At first, the officials tried to stay calm. They called it a flare-up, a temporary rise, a manageable setback. The words sounded neat in public briefings, clean and controlled, the kind of words governments use when they're trying not to panic in front of their own people. But disease did not care about neat words. It moved through crowded streets and hospital corridors with the same cold patience it always had. It slipped into homes, into schools, into transport hubs. It settled in lungs and turned breathing into labor. Within days, the southern provinces reported clusters, then the industrial belts, then the farming zones beyond the inner cities. The old plague was back, and this time, Megan Holt was not there to stop it. For 11 years, she had done more than create a treatment. She had built an entire system around it. She had adjusted doses for regional mutations, redesigned delivery methods for Dravari biology, corrected failures no one else even understood, and spent long nights watching data screens while the rest of the planet slept. The enzyme inhibitor she created had never been simple, no matter how casually the Dravari leadership spoke about it. To them, it had become routine. To Megan, it had always been a miracle held together by effort. Now the weekly supply was gone. The last stored batches ran out faster than anyone expected. Laboratories tried to recreate the formula from partial notes and public records, but what they had was not enough. The treatment had been the result of 11 years of trial, failure, instinct, correction, and lived understanding. The science was there, but the wisdom behind it had left with the woman who carried it. No one on Dravari had asked her to teach them. No one had thought they needed to. Hospitals filled in less than 2 weeks. Then they overflowed. Hallways turned into treatment zones. Waiting rooms became triage centers. Doctors stopped speaking in hopeful terms. Nurses worked until their bodies shook. Families slept on cold floors outside sealed wards, listening for news that often never came. Children coughed until they could not stand. Parents pressed cloth to burning foreheads. Old people stared at ceilings and counted breaths like they were counting the last coins left in a ruined house. The Dravari government sent urgent calls to allied systems, then to neutral systems, then to the Council itself. Medical teams arrived from a few worlds, willing but unprepared. They brought standard antivirals, fluid support, field beds, sterilization tents, useful things, necessary things, but not the one thing that mattered. The cure was not missing because it had been destroyed. It was missing because the people who depended on it had never thought to value the mind that made it. When the Dravari ambassador stood before the council, he no longer looked proud. The sharp poise his species was known for had collapsed under exhaustion. His clothes were wrinkled. His voice broke on the first sentence and never fully steadied after that. He spoke of children dying in corridors because there were no more rooms. He spoke of doctors choosing who would get oxygen and who would not. He spoke of whole districts sealed under emergency quarantine while families begged through closed doors. And then, in front of the full chamber, he asked for human assistance. No one answered right away, because every being in that room knew the truth. There was no line to Earth anymore, no hand waiting on the other side, no human lab standing ready to save them from a disaster they had helped create through years of arrogance and neglect. Rillis sat frozen in her seat, fingers locked together so tightly they hurt. She did not look at the ambassador. She could not.
She kept thinking about Megan Holt packing her research into sealed archives, while a world behind her still believed she would never really leave. There are losses that feel sudden, and there are losses that are really the final bill for years of carelessness. This was the second kind. By the end of the month, the plague had crossed every major population zone on Dravari. Military vehicles blocked roads. Hospitals turned people away because there was no more space. The death numbers rose so fast that the official reports stopped sounding like records and started sounding like prayers whispered by people who already knew they would not be answered. The galaxy had once looked at human help and seen convenience. Now it looked at its absence and saw the shape of disaster. But even as one world drowned in sickness, another fire was beginning to rise, the kind that did not spread through lungs, but through pride, anger, and old hatred. And no one left in the council knew how to stop it. While Dravari choked on a cure it never learned to make, two border empires were only one mistake away from war.
The mistake was small. That was how these things always started. A mining vessel from the Thalen crossed into disputed space by less than 1,000 meters. In a better year, it would have led to angry messages, a long meeting, and someone forced to apologize through gritted teeth. In another time, human diplomats would have already been on their way before the first report even reached the council. They would have called both sides, lowered voices, slowed tempers, and translated not just words, but meaning. They had done it for more than a century. But this was not a better year, and those diplomats were gone. The Veli patrol on the border did not issue a warning. They fired first. The mining ship broke apart in open space, its cargo scattering in a glittering cloud of metal and ice. The transmission from the crew cut off in the middle of a scream. By the time the debris finished drifting, both governments were already accusing the other of planned aggression. The Thalen said the Veli had murdered civilians. The Veli said the Thalen had tested their patience for the last time. Both were angry, both were armed, and neither had anyone left who knew how to cool a fire before it became an inferno. Within 24 hours, warships began moving toward the border. Within 48, defense screens lit up across 6 nearby systems. Within 4 days, more than 100 armed vessels faced one another across a line that had held for 112 years. On Avera, the council chamber felt different now. The old arrogance was still there in some corners, but it no longer sounded confident. It sounded brittle. Every new report came faster than the last. One crisis was not ending before the next one began. Delegates who used to speak with polished certainty now whispered in tense little groups, glancing at doors, checking datapads, avoiding each other's eyes. Defense Minister Cravath stood in the council war room staring at a tactical display, so crowded with symbols that it looked like it might split open. He had once called human fleets decorative at a formal dinner. People had laughed. It had seemed clever at the time, easy, safe. It did not feel clever now. He watched fleet markers slide closer to conflict zones, watched supply lines stretch, watched military predictions turn red one after another. He had ranks and titles and polished medals on his chest, but none of that gave him what he needed most: experience. For 2 centuries, every major peacekeeping action in the Council had been written, led, organized, and carried on human shoulders. Human officers made the plans. Human crews held the dangerous ground between enemies. Human negotiators stepped into rooms no one else wanted to enter. They absorbed the rage, the insults, the mistrust, and somehow kept entire sectors from burning. Cravath had never bothered to study how they did it. He had assumed there would always be humans to do it again. Now the room around him filled with officers who knew how to fight, but not how to stop fighting. Those were different skills. Human commanders had understood that. Most others never needed to, not until now.
On the border itself, fear spread faster than orders. Civilian stations began evacuating. Freight ships turned away from the contested zone. Colonies stocked bunkers and ration stores. Parents pulled children from schools. Traders rushed to move what they could before the route collapsed completely. Everywhere, ordinary people felt the same terrible truth before their leaders admitted it. The old balance was gone. A single broken ship had become a spark. Pride became fuel. Old resentment became oxygen. And the galaxy had lost the people who used to stand in the middle and refuse to move. Rillis watched the updates from her office with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned pale. She remembered human envoys moving between enemy capitals year after year, carrying proposals nobody appreciated and solving problems nobody thanked them for solving. She remembered how often the Council rolled its eyes at those efforts, as if peace were something simple and automatic instead of delicate, exhausting labor done by patient people willing to be hated by both sides. She had seen it, and she had not defended it enough. That thought stayed with her like a stone under the heart. By the 5th day, the first major fleet exchange erupted near a barren moon on the edge of disputed territory. It was not yet a full war, not officially. That was the lie governments told themselves when they were too proud to call disaster by its real name. But ships were burning, pilots were dying, worlds were choosing sides, and every hour the fighting continued made it harder to imagine going back. The Council still told itself there was time. There wasn't. Because while the border burned, another kind of collapse was beginning far from the battle lines, quieter, slower, and somehow just as deadly. Systems the galaxy depended on were starting to fail, one by one, and the first time people were asking a question they should have asked years ago. Who had been keeping all of this running? As the war spread across the stars, Cephas opened a deeper audit, and what he found made the whole galaxy look like a machine already breaking from the inside.
Cephas had spent most of his life believing that systems mattered more than people. Numbers were honest, reports were clean, supply charts, maintenance schedules, transit logs. These things made sense to him in ways speeches never did. People lied, pride lied, politics lied. But numbers, if you looked long enough, eventually told the truth. And now the truth was terrifying. He stood alone in his office on Avira, surrounded by floating screens filled with repair histories, energy outputs, route failures, and emergency requests from half the galaxy. What had started as a logistics audit had become something much worse. It was no longer about missing supplies or delayed convoys. It was about discovering that entire worlds had been standing on human work no one had ever acknowledged. A power grid on a Melvari station failed first. At a glance, it looked like normal wear. Then Cephas dug deeper. The grid had been unstable for years, but hidden inside its old architecture were dozens of quiet human modifications, reinforced relays, emergency bypasses, load balancing patches. None of them had ever been officially requested. None had ever been properly documented in Council records. Human engineers had simply seen a weak system, fixed it, and moved on. Now the unofficial fixes were wearing out. Then came the communication array failure in the Corvai system. 12 colonies went dark for nearly 2 days. Medical requests, shipping updates, emergency alerts, all cut off at once. Again, the same pattern appeared. Human technicians had been maintaining backup systems the colonies never even knew they had. Then a water purification plant on a Thalen border world began poisoning its own population. Not by sabotage, not by attack, because a filter upgrade a human engineer had installed 14 years earlier had finally failed, and no one on that world even knew the upgrade existed until the water turned bad. Cephas stared at the galactic map as more alerts lit it red. Station supports weakening,
Agricultural climate systems failing, docking control software crashing, fuel station regulators drifting out of calibration. Each report looked separate at first, but together they formed one terrible picture. Humanity had not just helped the galaxy, humanity had quietly held it together. Not through glory, not through power, through maintenance, through long hours and thankless work and ugly repairs in places no one important ever visited, through hundreds of thousands of choices to fix what was broken and move on without applause. The galaxy had mistaken that humility for smallness. Now it was paying for that mistake. Cephas brought everything to Chancellor Vorath again, every report, every projection, every warning. Vorath skimmed the data and looked annoyed more than afraid. Then train replacements, he said. Cephas could barely believe what he was hearing. With what time? With whose expertise? Vorath leaned back as if the problem were still theoretical. You are making this sound larger than it is. Larger than it is. Cephas felt something inside him hardened at those words. Not rage, not yet, just the cold realization that some leaders could watch the floor crack beneath them and still complain about the noise. Outside the council walls, ordinary beings were learning faster. Families on blacked-out stations sat in dark apartments listening to failing air systems. Traders stranded at dead relays cursed routes that no longer worked. Entire neighborhoods boiled unsafe water and prayed their children would not get sick. The galaxy's comfort had not vanished at all at once. It was peeling away layer by layer, revealing how much of daily life had rested on unseen human hands. And those hands were gone. Cephas looked again at the bleeding map and understood that the collapse was no longer coming. It had already begun. The galaxy had mocked the people who fixed broken things because fixing broken things did not look impressive. But now the repairs were ending, and everyone was learning the same brutal lesson. Civilization does not only depend on those who lead it, it depends even more on those who quietly keep it from falling apart. While infrastructure failed across 100 systems, one human voice still remained in alien space, and the story she chose to write was about to make the whole galaxy feel shame for the first time.
Katie Marsh had stayed behind on purpose. When the human withdrawal began, she could have gone home with the others. She had the clearance, the route, the chance to leave before the borders tightened. But something inside her refused. Not because she disagreed with humanity's decision. She understood it too well for that. She stayed because someone needed to watch what came after. Someone needed to write it down while the galaxy was still trying to lie to itself. So she rented a narrow room on Outpost Ven, a neutral trade station that smelled like machine oil, stale spice, and recycled air. The room was barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and the terminal she spent most of her nights staring into. But it was enough. From there, she listened. She interviewed traders whose routes had collapsed, dock workers from stations losing power, refugees from the Phelan Valley War, families from worlds touched by the Dravari Plague. Again and again the same pattern appeared. The details changed, the species changed, the words changed, but the shape of the story stayed the same. Everywhere she looked, people were discovering what humans had been doing for them. Too late. That morning, she sat across from an elderly Corvi shopkeeper whose hands would not stop trembling. He sold fabric and sewing thread from a market stall near Dock Ring 3. For 20 years, he had lived on a station where human families once came and went in steady numbers. He told Katie they used to notice things no one else noticed. A flickering light in a hallway, a loose panel near an air vent, a cracked bench outside the market, a leak under a pipe. They never made a speech about it, the old man said. They just fixed it. Katie asked if anyone had thanked them. The shopkeeper gave her a tired, embarrassed smile. Not enough, he said.
That answer stayed with her all afternoon. By evening, she had written the piece. She did not make it dramatic. She did not fill it with shouting or blame. She kept it simple because the truth was already sharp enough. She wrote about the little things humans had done across the galaxy. The repairs, the extra shifts, the unpaid help, the quiet choices to make life easier for people who often gave nothing back. She wrote about how kindness becomes invisible when it is constant, how people stop seeing help when help never asks to be seen. She gave the article a plain title, What They Were Doing While We Looked Away. Then she published it. The response came faster than anything she had ever written before. Within hours, the article had spread through trade nets, local forums, station boards, and official channels. Within days, it had been translated into dozens of languages. Billions read it. Many read it in silence. Some cried. Some denied it at first, but then the memories began. A human medic who stayed after his shift to sit with a frightened child. A human mechanic who fixed a stranger's heating unit during winter. A human officer who escorted civilian ships through dangerous lanes and never even introduced herself. A human teacher who spent years on a remote colony helping students no one important had ever cared about. Every species had its version. Every world had its forgotten story. And together those stories formed something heavier than accusation. They formed proof. On Avera, Rillis read the article alone in her office and had to stop twice because her vision blurred. Cephas read it after midnight, surrounded by failing reports, and understood that his numbers had only shown one half of the truth. The systems were collapsing, yes, but something else had collapsed first. Gratitude, attention, basic decency. Katie sat in her little room that night and watched the article spread across the stars. She did not feel triumph, only sadness, because shame had finally reached the galaxy, but shame always arrived after the damage was done. And outside her window, Outpost Ven groaned softly around her, another aging station held together by repairs no one fully understood anymore. The article opened old eyes, but while the galaxy was learning to feel shame, the war at the border was becoming something far worse than anyone had feared. By the time the galaxy learned how to feel shame, shame was no longer enough. The war on the Thalen Valley border had grown teeth. What began as one destroyed mining vessel had become a chain of retaliation so fast and so bitter that even those giving the orders could no longer pretend they were still in control. Fleet met fleet in the dark between stars. Supply stations became targets. Civilian corridors turned dangerous overnight. Worlds that had once watched the border crisis from a distance now found themselves pulled into it through alliances, debts, fear, and old grudges nobody had fully buried. On the sixth contested system, a moon that had once been little more than a refueling stop became the site of a massacre. Not because it was strategic, not because it held rare resources, but because wounded governments needed symbols, and symbols were easier to destroy than pride. The moon's station carried medics, fuel crews, freight handlers, families, and children. It should have been protected by every treaty the Council claimed to stand for. It burned anyway. After that, the language changed. No one spoke of tension anymore. No one called it a border dispute. It was war now, open and undeniable, and it moved with the cruel momentum of something that had waited too many years for an excuse. The Council tried to assemble a peacekeeping force. That failure was almost worse than the war itself. Ships were available, yes, weapons too. Officers with rank, medals, and polished records stepped forward. But when planners gathered to organize a real intervention, the truth became impossible to hide. Every major peacekeeping model the Council had relied on for 2 centuries had been human-built, human-led, human-tested in real fire, under real pressure, with real lives hanging in the balance. The knowledge meant little when no one had respected enough to learn it in time. Back on Avera, Rillis stood before another emergency session and saw the fear plainly now. It lived in every face. Even the proud delegates sat differently. Their confidence had drained out of them, leaving only fatigue and the terrible understanding that they were all standing inside a machine coming apart piece by piece. And still the war kept growing, because fires do not care when people finally regret striking the first match. As battle lines spread and peace failed, the galaxy's economy began to crack, and this time, entire worlds were going to starve for what they had refused to value.
The economy did not collapse in one loud moment. It sagged first, then it cracked. Then, before anyone truly accepted what was happening, whole sections of the galaxy were falling through it. Trade routes that had once moved with steady rhythm now stuttered like a dying pulse. Cargo ships sat waiting for fuel that never arrived. Convoys delayed departure because no one trusted the old safe lanes anymore. Navigation beacons failed one after another, and captains began taking longer, riskier paths through half-mapped space just to avoid the graveyards the main corridors had become. Insurance firms were the first to say aloud what others still avoided. The fringe corridor was no longer a route. It was a coffin with engines. The moment those insurers pulled back, panic spread through commerce like poison through blood. Freight prices doubled, then tripled. Emergency shipments were delayed. Medical supplies expired in storage while worlds waited for safe passage. Food transports were rerouted so many times that some never arrived at all. On 3 outer systems, rationing began within weeks. On 2 more, riots followed. The Corvi homeworld had always relied on imported grain to balance its poor growing seasons. The Cellin depended on rare mineral shipments to run their atmospheric stabilizers. Neither system had prepared for what human withdrawal would truly mean, because like everyone else, they had assumed the machine beneath them was permanent. Now grocery sectors stood half empty. Water processors slowed. Power cuts became part of daily life. Parents lined up for hours to receive half portions that would not have fed a family even in kinder years. Children learned the sound of hunger before they learned the names of the officials promising help. And on Avera, the council met every day under lights that felt colder than they used to. The reports came in waves. Trade volume down by 60%, entire shipping networks abandoned, fuel depots dry, colonial supply chains severed, outer worlds requesting emergency support that no one knew how to deliver. Everywhere the same truth echoed. The galaxy had built its comfort on labor it never respected. Now it was discovering how expensive contempt could become. At the same time, the Thalen Valley War crossed another line. Weapons long banned under Council law were used on contested worlds. Atmospheres burned, oceans were poisoned, soil turned sterile. These were not just attacks, they were acts designed to make recovery impossible. The treaties forbidding such weapons had once been negotiated by human legal teams, monitored by human observers, enforced by human-backed systems. Without them, the laws still existed on paper, but paper had never stopped anyone determined to destroy. By the end of the week, even Chancellor Vorath's allies could no longer pretend he was fit to lead. He was removed not with violence, but with something colder. 9 delegates from 9 different species walked into the chamber during session, surrounded him at the podium, and told him his time was over. No shouting, no spectacle, just exhausted faces and a silence heavy enough to crush pride. When Vorath tried to speak, one delegate said quietly, "You have spoken enough." No one defended him. No one even looked at him as he left. And when the chamber doors closed behind him, the galaxy did not feel relief, only dread.
because removing the man who ignored the collapse did not stop the collapse itself. Rillis was named interim chancellor that same day. She didn't want the title. You could see it in her eyes when she accepted it. But someone had to take the chair, and everyone in the room knew the truth. The time of denial was over. The time of begging had begun. With worlds starving and the old order broken, Rillis made a choice no leader before her had dared. She stopped speaking like a politician and started speaking like someone asking for forgiveness.
Rillis waited until the chamber was empty before she began. For the first time in many months, she did not ask for aides, speechwriters, or policy advisors. She sent everyone away. The office felt larger without them, quieter, almost severe. Outside the tall windows of Avera, traffic moved through the night in thin lines of light. Inside, she sat alone in front of a recording device and looked at her own reflection in the dark lens. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she started speaking, not as chancellor, not as a council leader, not as the careful diplomat she had trained herself to be for most of her life. She spoke as someone who had finally understood the weight of a kindness she had once failed to defend. She told Earth about a human doctor who had come to the Corvi homeworld during the Scythan flu outbreak many years earlier. His name was Samuel Reeves. He had arrived on an old transport loaded with medicine, equipment, and supplies he had partly paid for himself. He stayed for 40 days. He worked until exhaustion made his hands shake. He slept in corridors because there were no beds left. He treated thousands. He saved over 12,000 lives. When the crisis ended, her government had sent him a formal note. One paragraph, nothing more. Rillis paused there, and for a second her voice almost broke, but she kept going. She spoke of human engineers who had rebuilt the Corvi aqueduct system after the great earthquakes. They had worked for 2 years in dust, heat, and dangerous conditions. When the final pumps came online and clean water returned to cities that had nearly lost hope, those engineers refused extra payment. One of them, a young woman with burned skin and tired eyes, had simply said, "You needed water. We knew how to bring it." At the time, the words had sounded simple. Now they sounded holy. Rillis looked directly into the camera. "We were ungrateful," she said. "We were arrogant. We looked at what you gave and treated it as something ordinary. We saw your kindness and called it weakness. We saw your patience and mistook it for submission. We were wrong." She took a breath, and the next words came softer. "We were wrong about all of it." The message lasted 11 minutes. There were no demands in it, no bargains, no political tricks hidden behind polished language. She did not ask humanity to return. She did not pretend the galaxy deserved another chance. She simply said the one thing the Council should have said long ago. She said she was sorry. Deeply, plainly, completely. When the message was sent toward human space, it crossed the dark in total silence. Day after day, the channel remained open. Every morning, Rillis checked for a reply before reading her reports. Every morning, there was nothing waiting for her. No answer, no rejection, no comfort. Only that same clean, deliberate quiet humanity had left behind. Still, she kept the channel open, because some apologies are not made to receive forgiveness. Some are made because truth finally becomes heavier than pride. And while Rillis waited for a response that did not come, one human being chose to do something even more dangerous than sending a message. She crossed the border. While the Council waited in silence, journalist Katie Marsh turned her ship toward human space, and what she found there would change the galaxy's understanding forever.
Katie Marsh had been called reckless before. This time, the word felt too small. She fueled her little ship at Outpost Ven, loaded enough food and water for a month, checked her engines twice, and filed a flight plan that made 3 station officers stare at her like she had lost her mind.
Maybe she had. But the galaxy was drowning in rumors, shame, and silence, and Katie could not keep riding from the edge of the storm forever. She needed to see what waited on the other side. So she turned her ship toward human space. The farther she flew, the quieter the stars seemed. Traffic thinned. Open channels faded. The noise of the wider galaxy fell behind her until all she could hear was the steady hum of her own ship and the sound of her breathing in the cockpit. She had expected many things. Anger, maybe. Military barricades. Mines. Cold warnings. Perhaps even wreckage, signs of a civilization still pulling back from the worlds it had left behind. What she found instead was order. Human stations were active, bright, and calm. Their lights burned steady in the dark. Traffic moved in neat patterns, controlled and measured, not rushed, not afraid. Patrol signatures appeared around her within minutes of crossing the boundary, but they did not swarm. They simply watched, careful, professional, certain. Then one patrol ship moved ahead of the others and opened a channel. Its name was the Ridge Line. The officer on the screen looked young, maybe younger than Katie expected for someone holding a border post at such a moment. His uniform was simple. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and respectful. Unidentified civilian vessel, this is Lieutenant Aaron Price of the patrol ship Ridgeline. Please state your identity and your purpose. Katie gave her name, told him she was a journalist, told him she came alone and came peacefully. Then she said the truth. The galaxy is falling apart, she said. I wanted to understand why you left. Aaron Price was quiet for a second. Not offended. Not hostile, just tired in a way that felt older than his face. Ma'am, he said at last, I appreciate you coming all this way, I do, but I can't let you through. This border is closed. Katie swallowed. Is this punishment? His eyes stayed on her through the screen. No. Then is it revenge? Again, that small pause. No, ma'am. There was no heat in his voice, no bitterness sharp enough to wound, and somehow that hurt more. Katie leaned closer. Then what is it? Aaron looked away for just a moment, as if searching for words he had already used too many times in his own heart. When people spend centuries giving everything they have, and they are told again and again that it means nothing, eventually they stop offering. Katie said nothing. She could feel the answer settling into her like a stone. Aaron continued, softer now. We're not trying to hurt anyone. We're not teaching lessons. We're just done. Then, after a breath, he added something that stayed with her forever. I have a daughter. She's 4. She has never once been laughed at for helping someone. She has never been made to feel small for caring. I'd like to keep it that way. Katie's throat tightened, because that was it. Not hatred, not fury, protection. Humanity had not built a wall to punish the galaxy. It had built one to protect what was still tender inside itself. Aaron gave safe coordinates to turn back, wished her a peaceful return, then the channel closed. Katie sat alone in her cockpit for a long time, staring at the dark line between two futures. One side had finally learned shame, the other had finally chosen peace. And for the first time, she understood that the most painful thing about humanity's departure was not that they left angry, it was that they left gently. Katie returned with the truth, and when her report spread across the stars, the entire galaxy was forced to face the one feeling it had avoided from the start: shame.
Katie published her report before the engines on her ship had fully cooled. She did not decorate it with drama. She did not sharpen it into anger. She simply wrote what she had seen at the border, what Aaron Price had said, and what his voice had carried beneath those careful words.
Humanity had not sealed itself away in rage. It had stepped back in sorrow. It had chosen distance, not because it wanted the galaxy to suffer, but because it no longer wanted its children to grow up learning that kindness would always be mocked, used, and dismissed. That truth spread faster than any accusation ever could. Across stations, homeworlds, cargo networks, and public forums, beings read the report and felt something inside them give way. For months, many had still clung to excuses. They blamed politics, they blamed fear, they blamed human pride, human stubbornness, human weakness. It was easier to do that than to face the harder answer. Now the harder answer stood in front of them, impossible to ignore. The galaxy had not been abandoned by a cruel species. It had been left behind by a generous one. And generosity, once exhausted, did not roar when it died. It went quiet. On Avera, Rillis read Kading's words in the dim light of her office and covered her mouth with one hand, as if that could somehow contain the ache moving through her. She kept returning to the same line, the one about Aaron's daughter, a 4-year-old child living in peace, protected from the slow cuts her people had handed to human hearts for centuries. Rillis thought of Jake Ellison leaving the chamber without a word, thought of all the moments before that one, the many smaller moments when the council could have chosen respect and did not. Cephas, reading the report in the middle of another terrible night of failing systems and emergency appeals, finally understood something his audits never could have shown him. Infrastructure had not only been supported by human labor, it had been supported by human belief. Belief that helping mattered. Belief that service had value even when unrecognized. Belief that if something was broken, it should be repaired simply because people depended on it. The galaxy had not just drained human resources, it had drained human hope. And now it wanted the results without the heart that made them possible. That could never work. In the weeks that followed, the mood across the stars changed. Not into peace, not yet. The war still smoldered. Hunger still stalked too many worlds. Plagues did not vanish because people felt guilty. Broken systems did not repair themselves because someone finally learned humility. But shame did something important. It ended the lies. More leaders began speaking honestly. More records were opened. More testimonies were shared. Stories rose from every corner of known space about humans who had stepped in quietly, fixed impossible problems, and asked almost nothing in return. The galaxy had once treated those acts as background noise. Now they sounded like a eulogy for something precious. And deep inside human space, that precious thing was no longer waiting for applause. It was healing without them. That was the hardest part for the galaxy to accept. Not that humanity had suffered, but that humanity had found a way to live without needing the galaxy at all. 2 years after the departure, the Council gathered for a final reckoning, not to ask humanity to return, but to face the full weight of what had been lost forever.
2 years after humanity left, the galaxy was still alive. Barely. The war between the Thalen and the Valley had not ended through wisdom or diplomacy. It ended because both sides were broken. Their fleets were shattered. Their border worlds were scarred beyond repair. Too many soldiers were dead. Too many families were gone. In the end, they stopped fighting not because peace had won, but because exhaustion had. On Dravali, the plague was no longer an outbreak. It was a wound that had settled into the body of a whole world. Quarantine walls split cities apart. Entire regions lived under permanent restriction. The official death numbers kept rising, but most people had stopped speaking them aloud. Some grief becomes too large for counting. Trade had returned in a weak, careful way, but only enough to keep certain worlds from total collapse.
Ships moved through old lanes with fear instead of confidence. Pirates still hunted. Supply chains still broke. Power still failed in places where human hands had once quietly kept everything running. The galaxy had not found a way back to what it was. It had only learned how to survive being less. On Avera, Rillis called for a special session of the Council. She did not call it a strategy summit. She did not call it a recovery review. She called it what it truly was, a remembrance. The great chamber filled slowly that morning. Many familiar faces were gone, replaced by newer delegates carrying the tired eyes of worlds that had suffered too much in too little time. No one spoke loudly. No one argued in the halls. The room that had once laughed at human sacrifice now felt almost sacred in its silence. Cephas stood at the central podium, holding a document he had spent months preparing. It was not a policy report. It was an accounting. A full record of everything humanity had given the galaxy during 4 centuries of council membership. Every convoy protected, every plague fought, every station repaired, every famine reduced, every treaty negotiated, every war delayed, softened, or prevented, every invisible kindness that had become the skeleton holding civilization upright, while others took credit for the skin. Then he began to read. For 6 hours the chamber listened. He read of human ships pulling civilians out of burning war zones while under fire. He read of doctors entering plague systems knowing they might never leave. He read of engineers living on remote alien stations for decades, fixing failures no one else knew how to touch. He read of diplomats who learned hostile languages and painful histories because they believed understanding another people was the first step toward keeping them alive. The chamber did not interrupt. Some delegates wept openly. Some bowed their heads. Some sat completely still, like people hearing the truth so clearly that it hurt to breathe. At the end, Cephas paused and looked down at the final page. "I added one personal line," he said, voice rough with fatigue. "I hope the council will forgive me." Then he read it. No species gave more and asked for less. No species was thanked less for what it gave. This is not humanity's shame. It is ours. When he stepped away from the podium, no one spoke for a long time. Then Rillis rose. She proposed a memorial. Not a monument to human glory, she said, because humans had never asked for glory. A monument instead to the galaxy's failure. A warning carved into stone so no future generation could pretend not to know what indifference costs. The vote was unanimous. It was the first unanimous vote in council history. Months later, the memorial stood in the center of Avera's diplomatic quarter. A long wall of dark stone, carved with the names of every human known to have served the wider galaxy and received little or nothing in return. It stretched farther than visitors expected. That was part of the pain. There had been so many names. Rillis visited every morning. She ran her fingers across the carved letters and whispered apologies to people who would never hear them. Far beyond the border, human worlds lived on. They built schools, they planted gardens, they repaired homes, they raised children who slept safely and laughed easily. They told old stories by warm lights. They held hands on quiet evenings. They sang songs in kitchens, on porches, in small rooms filled with peace. And they did not think much about the galaxy anymore. That was the true price. Not revenge, not war, not some terrible fleet descending from the dark. The real price was simpler, softer, and far more final. It was a father sitting on a porch at sunset, watching his daughter chase fireflies through tall summer grass, and feeling no anger at all, no bitterness, no need to look back, just peace. The galaxy had not lost humanity to violence. It had lost humanity to its own indifference. For centuries, it had treated human kindness like a tool that would always be there. It mocked the hand that fixed its broken machines, saved its children, guarded its roads, and carried its burdens. And in the end, humanity believed the message it had been given over and over, that its love was worth nothing. So it took that love home. And that was the wound no treaty could heal. Because by the time the galaxy finally understood what humans had been, humanity had already learned something even more powerful: how to live beautifully without being needed. And so the stars grew quieter. The council endured. The world survived. The memorial remained. But somewhere beyond the borders, in warm homes under peaceful skies, humanity moved forward at last, not with hatred, not with triumph, but with gentle, irreversible absence. And the galaxy, left behind with its grief, finally understood the cost of losing the people who had once held it together with open hands. The story was over, but the lesson remained. Kindness ignored long enough does not turn into anger. Sometimes it simply leaves. May this message strengthen your faith and renew your hope. Thank you for staying until the end. If this touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe to Astro Realms for more uplifting content. May God's blessings overflow in your life. See you soon.